I remember the streets of Petrograd in 1917 like I remember the back of my own hand, only now I see them through the haze of memory and time. The world had changed overnight, but back then it didn't feel like change. It felt like the ground had been torn out from beneath us, and no one knew where to stand anymore. I had been a soldier in the Imperial Army, stuck in the endless grind of the Eastern Front, staring down German machine guns in the trenches. That war was supposed to be the fight for Russia's survival, but we had long ago lost the will to keep fighting. The trenches were filled with filth, the mud clung to everything, and the constant sound of artillery had turned men into walking ghosts. We fought, we bled, and many of us died. But it was nothing compared to what awaited back home. The revolution, the real revolution, hadn't even arrived yet, not in any form we could recognize. I had heard rumors of strikes, of unrest, of workers chanting slogans in the streets of Petrograd, but what did that have to do with me? I had no stake in it. I was a soldier, a man who was meant to follow orders, not question them. That was my job. But that all changed on February 23rd, 1917. I remember the day like it was yesterday, only it wasn't. It was the day we were told the Tsar was gone. Nicholas II, our emperor, had abdicated. The throne that had held Russia together for centuries now lay shattered, and in its place confusion reigned. I remember the whispers in the barracks, the men talking in hushed tones about the provisional government that was taking control. No one knew who they were. We were soldiers after all, not politicians. What did we care about some new government in Petrograd? We just wanted to survive another day. But the streets of Petrograd were already starting to fill with people, workers, soldiers, revolutionaries, all of them eager to change what had been. The air was thick with uncertainty, and I, like many others, was torn between fear and a strange, growing excitement. But we weren't just watching from the sidelines. Petrograd was in the throes of revolution, and we could feel it in the ground beneath our boots. One moment, I was with my comrades, fighting to stay alive in the snow and the muck of the Eastern Front. The next, I was staring into the uncertainty of what would come next for us. In the chaos of the revolution, the news came to us. The Tsar was gone, but the power vacuum left behind was enormous. The streets of Petrograd were filled with soldiers, us, now wondering what we were meant to fight for. It was in October 1917, after the October Revolution, when everything truly began to shift for me. The Bolsheviks, Lenin, Trotsky, they were names we barely understood, but they were making their move. The Tsar was gone, the old empire was gone, and the future of Russia was now in the hands of men we hadn't chosen, but who had seized power with a determination that was both terrifying and magnetic. The world had fallen into chaos. The Tsar was overthrown, and the White Guards were assembling, trying to restore the monarchy, or at least something like it. We had no idea what was coming. We had no idea what side we were on. Some of the men were already deserting. They had heard of the promises of bread, land, and peace, and for them, that was enough. The Bolsheviks had taken control of Petrograd, and they made promises to the workers, to the peasants, to the soldiers, but they made no promises to us. We were just another pawn in their game. I still remember the day I joined the Red Guards. There was nothing romantic about it. There was nothing noble. We were just young men, many of us soldiers who had deserted the front lines of the Great War, else to fight for but the revolution. It didn't matter that we didn't fully understand what was happening or what the Bolshevik ideals were. What mattered was that we had no future under the old system, and the provisional government that replaced the Tsar seemed no better. Trotsky's speeches stirred something in us, something angry and hopeful at the same time. Leon Trotsky, standing there in his military coat, issuing commands, promising a workers' state. It was hard not to follow him. I wasn't the only one who felt that way. Petrograd was full of young men, soldiers, and workers, eager to see something new, something better. But there was a dark undertone to it all. The violence in the streets had already started. We fought against the old regime. Yes, but we also fought against ourselves. Brother turned on brother. The city was a battlefield, and the night air was thick with fear and rage. There was no longer any clear distinction between friend and foe. There were days when I couldn't remember who I was fighting for. There were days when the revolution felt as hollow as the old empire. Lenin promised a world without kings, without capitalists, without the old czars who had led us into war. But what about the soldiers? What about us? We had fought so long and so hard, and now in the streets of Petrograd, we fought each other. The Red Guards clashed with the White Guards in the streets, firing their rifles at anything that moved. The Bolsheviks were forming their Red Army, and we were being swept into their cause, whether we were ready or not. I remember watching as one of my comrades, a young man named Ivan, fell. He was a worker, not a soldier, and he had joined the Red Guards to fight for a better future. But that future felt increasingly uncertain. He fell, shot by a White Guard, and I saw his face as he bled out on the cobblestones, his wide eyes staring at the gray sky above. I couldn't help but wonder, in that moment, if this revolution was worth it. Was this how it was supposed to be? The streets of Petrograd were filled with death, with the screams of men and women who had given everything for a cause that was rapidly becoming as broken as the empire it had replaced. And yet, in the midst of it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was no turning back. I had already crossed the line. By 1918, the war had shifted from confusion and chaos to something far more defined, though not by any clarity of purpose. Petrograd had fallen under the control of the Bolsheviks, and the streets were teeming with soldiers, workers, and militants, each of us uncertain what we were fighting for, but all certain that the old regime had to be crushed. The world I had known had dissolved, but in its place was a new world, a terrifying and exciting world where the lines between revolutionaries and traitors blurred beyond recognition. Trotsky had become the face of this new Red Army, his presence electric, his speeches filled with the fire of promise. He moved among us, often directing operations from his iconic armored train, barking out orders and pushing us forward into battle with words that felt like they could move mountains. He spoke of a workers' revolution, of peace, bread, and land. But as I stood among those who followed him, I began to see the cracks in his vision. We weren't soldiers. We were just desperate men trying to survive, clinging to whatever ideals we had left. I remember the first real battle. It wasn't grand or heroic, but it was necessary. Tsaritsyn, a small city that would one day be called Stalingrad, was our first true test. The White Army had advanced, and our Red forces were desperately trying to hold our ground.
We were outnumbered and outgunned, but we didn't care. The whites, led by General Denikin, were marching to crush the revolution before it could take root. It was a bitter, ugly fight. The enemy was ruthless, their artillery thundering against our positions, but we held them off, just barely. I remember the first time I truly felt the weight of the Red Army on my shoulders, during the siege of Tsaritsyn. I was handed a Mosin Nagant rifle and told to hold the line, but we had no real training. We were peasants, workers, deserters from the Imperial Army, trying to survive in a war that had no clear meaning anymore. We fired at the White Army through the fog of war, through smoke and dust, but it felt like we were fighting ghosts. The cold winter of 1918 only added to the horror. The snow, the frozen ground, and the bitter winds took their toll on every soldier. The officers of the Red Army were inexperienced, and the soldiers were worse off, exhausted, hungry, and terrified. We had no idea if we were winning or losing. We were just caught in a struggle that felt more like survival than anything else. Still, we kept fighting, because what else was there to do? The whites were coming, and if we didn't hold Tsaritsyn, the revolution would be lost. It wasn't just the whites we had to worry about, though. There were the Cossacks, fiercely loyal to their land, but now pulled into the conflict. The Cossack cavalry, with their sabers drawn, charged at us again and again, cutting through our lines, their horses kicking up snow as they rode down any who were caught in their path. I saw men I knew fall in those charges, friends who had signed up for the revolution, only to be shredded by Cossack blades. But the worst part was the feeling of betrayal. As the battle raged on, I could hear whispers. Some of my fellow soldiers, those I had shared bread and water with, were quietly slipping away. The hunger, the cold, the terror, some of them had had enough. The Red Army, for all its revolutionary zeal, was becoming just another army, filled with men who cared more about survival than any ideal. The days blended together as we held Tsaritsyn. There was no rest, no relief. The soldiers on both sides were dying in the trenches, too weary to care about victory or defeat. But something changed in me during those weeks, something I can't quite explain. At first we fought for the revolution, for Trotsky's promises, but by the time we pushed the white forces back, we were just fighting to stay alive. The ideals that had brought us to the battlefield had long since faded into the cold, lifeless land. The dead, piled high in trenches, were all the proof we needed that this was not the noble war we had been promised. I still remember the look in the eyes of those men when we finally took Tsaritsyn. It wasn't triumph I saw in their faces. It was exhaustion, emptiness. We had won, yes, but at what cost? The city lay in ruins, and our comrades lay dead in the streets. I walked through the wreckage, my rifle in hand, my mind numb. This wasn't the revolution I had imagined. Bolshevik ideals were no longer enough to hold us together. In that moment, I saw the revolution not as an idea to fight for, but as a force that had consumed us, taking men's lives and souls without a second thought. As we moved forward, pushing against the White Army and the Cossack forces, I began to realize that war is not won by ideology. It's won by blood, by sacrifice. The Red Army had its victories, but at a terrible price. We fought on, but the hunger, the cold, and the endless death wore us down, until there was nothing left of us but the survivors, men who had learned how to kill, how to survive, but had forgotten what they were fighting for in the first place. I had joined the revolution as a young man, full of hope. But now, after Tsaritsyn, I was something else, something harder, something colder. The Red Army had changed me. I wasn't sure if I could go back to the ideals that had once driven me. I wasn't sure if there was anything left to fight for. The revolution had taken too much, but it wasn't over. The war wasn't over, and we kept moving forward because we had no other choice. By 1919, the fighting had grown even more bitter, more desperate. The White Army under General Denikin had regrouped, and their forces pushed relentlessly southward, determined to crush the revolution once and for all. The Red Army was still reeling from its victories, but the cost of the battle had been steep. And now, as we faced the white forces, I began to realize the true nature of the war we were in. This wasn't just about ideology, it was about survival. I remember the long marches through the Caucasus Mountains, the freezing winds biting through my coat, the Red Army trudging through mud and snow. We were barely holding on, our bodies numb from hunger and cold. We fought not for Trotsky's vision of a workers' state, but simply to stay alive, to keep moving forward. There were no clear lines anymore, no noble purpose. There was only the enemy ahead of us and the shattered remains of our comrades behind us. The Southern Front was like a different war altogether. The White Army wasn't just fighting for a throne or a cause, they were fighting for revenge. Denikin, a man who had been a general in the old Tsarist army, was ruthless in his pursuit of victory. His forces were better equipped and better trained. Their cavalry, Cossacks, swept down on us like a storm, their sabers flashing in the sunlight as they tore through our lines. We fought with what we had, but we were always on the defensive. There was one battle I'll never forget. Cossack cavalry broke through our ranks, and I saw my comrades cut down like cattle. I was in the thick of it, my Mosin-Nagant rifle firing wildly as I tried to hold my ground, but it was chaos. The Cossacks moved like shadows, their horses charging through the snow and mud. I saw Ivan, a soldier I had shared my rations with, fall to the ground, his throat slit by a Cossack's saber. His face was frozen in a mask of disbelief, but it was too late to save him. That moment haunted me for a long time. We retreated, but it didn't feel like a retreat. It felt like defeat. The White Army kept pushing, and we kept running. Every step I took felt like we were falling back into the past, the old Russia, the old order we had fought so hard to overthrow. And yet, here we were, running from men who fought to bring it all back. The irony was suffocating, but even in the face of retreat, there was no turning back. The Red Army had been forged in the fires of revolution, and we kept fighting. We didn't fight for Lenin or Trotsky anymore. We fought for the survival of the Red State, for the men beside us. There was no grand vision, no lofty ideal to hold on to. There was only the fight, and the blood we shed along the way. The Southern Front became a blur of violence. Each day was filled with skirmishes, ambushes, and counterattacks. We were constantly on the move, trying to outmaneuver the white forces, but they were always just behind us. The battlefields were littered with the bodies of the fallen comrades and enemies alike, and the smell of death clung to the air. It wasn't just the soldiers who suffered, it was the people, the peasants who had been caught in the middle of this madness. The land itself had turned against us, scorched by artillery, plundered by both sides. It was as if we were fighting for a future that could never exist. One day we were sent to defend a small town along the Don River, and the fighting was fierce. The white forces had surrounded us, and we were trapped. The battle lasted for days, with no reinforcements coming, and I could feel the weight of our situation. We had no supplies, no hope. We were running out of everything: food, ammunition, and even the will to keep fighting. Denikin's forces were pressing in on us, and I began to wonder if this was it, if we were going to die in this God-forsaken town, surrounded by the same ideals that had once brought us together. I remember looking at the faces of the men around me, faces filled with terror and resolve. There were no more words, no more speeches from Trotsky. There was only the grim reality of war. And yet, as the battle raged on, something inside me changed. I didn't care about the revolution anymore. I didn't care about Lenin's promises or the future we were supposed to build. I just wanted to survive. We all did. We fought off the white forces that day, but at what cost? The town was destroyed. The people were dead. And we had nothing left to show for it but more bodies. The revolution, the ideals we had fought for, seemed so far away in that moment. The war was no longer a fight for an idea. It was a fight for survival. That battle was a turning point for me. I had joined the revolution because I believed in the ideals: freedom, equality, peace. But now, in the chaos of the Southern Front, all of that seemed like a lie. Denikin, the whites, they were as ruthless as we were. No one had clean hands in this war, and all I had left was the fight to stay alive. The year 1919 found us far from the familiar faces of Petrograd, lost somewhere in the vastness of the Eastern Front. Admiral Kolchak, one of the most formidable leaders of the White Army, had declared himself the supreme ruler of Russia and was advancing through Siberia with an iron fist. His forces were well equipped, better trained, and ruthless. It felt like we were fighting not just for survival, but to preserve the very idea of the revolution. But the Red Army was exhausted, scattered, and ill-prepared for the ruthless campaign that Kolchak was leading. The land between us and him was vast and unforgiving. Endless stretches of Siberian wilderness, frozen and barren. I remember the endless marches through the snow, each day dragging on in a blur of fatigue and hunger. The ground was frozen hard, and the air was so cold that it seemed to freeze the very breath in our lungs. I don't think we were ever truly warm during those months. The Siberian cold seeped into your bones, turning every breath into a stab of icy pain. We wore what little we could, ragged uniforms that were once a proud symbol of the revolution, now torn and filthy, stained with the blood of comrades who had fallen along the way. Kolchak's forces were relentless, and we were always on the defensive. His army, marching north, seemed to swallow everything in its path. We retreated again and again, inching our way deeper into Siberia, where the winter seemed to last forever. But we had no choice. We couldn't let Kolchak advance further, or we would lose everything. The White Army's officers, trained in the old ways, knew how to fight, how to strategize. But our Red Army was a collection of deserters, factory workers, peasants. None of us were soldiers in the traditional sense. We fought because we had nowhere else to go. The first battle I remember in the east was in the small village of Krasnoyarsk, a place that seemed to be swallowed whole by the landscape. The fight was brutal, with no quarter given on either side. We had no hope of winning. We were too few, too weak. I still remember the sound of artillery, Russian-made cannons pounding our positions, sending men to the ground with each blast. Mosin Nagants fired in every direction, but they couldn't stop the advancing white cavalry. The Cossacks were the worst. Their sabers flashed in the dim light of the snowstorm as they charged through our lines, cutting down anything that moved. But there was something else, something that haunted me through all of this. The looks in the eyes of the soldiers around me. They weren't men of great conviction anymore. They were survivors. No one asked questions. The idealism that had brought us to the revolution had long since faded. We fought because it was all we knew. We fought because to stop fighting would be to surrender, not just to Kolchak, but to the world that had come before the revolution. A world where the Tsarist regime had ruled with oppression, where we had been nothing more than pawns. After Krasnoyarsk, the retreat became a desperate race against time and weather. We were freezing, starving, and our supply lines were constantly being disrupted by Kolchak's forces. And yet, we couldn't stop, not for a second. There was no time for rest. We moved on through Siberia's frozen wastes, and I saw men break. I saw them collapse from exhaustion, from hunger. And I saw men who had once been comrades turn their backs, deserting the Red Army to join the ranks of the Whites, or simply disappear into the wilderness, choosing to fade away into nothingness. One night, as we huddled in a dilapidated barn waiting for word of a new offensive, I heard a conversation between two soldiers. They spoke of the glory of the revolution, of how they had fought for the workers and peasants, but there was a hollow sound to their voices. They were no longer speaking of a cause. They were speaking of survival. And in that moment I realized something I had feared for a long time. Our cause was dying like the soldiers who fought for it. But I didn't speak. I had nothing left to say. I was as broken as they were. We continued to retreat across Siberia until spring came, and with it, a brief respite. Kolchak's forces had advanced so far that the Red Army was on the verge of collapse. But then something unexpected happened, foreign intervention. The Czech Legion, a force of Czechoslovak soldiers who had fought for the Imperial Russian Army in World War I, joined our ranks, and Trotsky launched a counteroffensive. For the first time in months, I saw the flicker of hope. The Red Army wasn't finished. We would fight again. The battles that followed were full of confusion, full of desperate pushes. The land itself seemed to fight against us. We were fighting not only Kolchak's forces, but the landscape, the unyielding Siberian winter. The battlefronts shifted constantly, and there were times when I wondered if we would ever be able to stop retreating. By the time 1920 rolled around, I'd been fighting for years. First on the Eastern Front against Kolchak, then on the Southern Front against Denikin and his White Army. But the fight that awaited us in the Polish-Soviet War was different. This wasn't just a battle for survival. This was a battle for the future of the Soviet Union, a chance to spread the revolution beyond the borders of Russia. Trotsky had once again rallied us with his speeches, promising that we would march across Europe, that we would carry the banner of revolution to the West. I remember the fiery speeches he gave as we prepared for battle, words that were meant to ignite our passion, to push us to fight not just for Russia, but for the entire world. I wanted to believe in those words. I needed to believe in them. But the reality of war had long since shattered my idealism. The first battles in Poland were a struggle. The Red Army was stretched thin, with our supply lines constantly disrupted, our men exhausted. We had gained a few victories, but the Polish forces, led by Marshal Józef Piłsudski, were proving to be a more formidable opponent than we had anticipated. Their soldiers were better trained, their tactics sharper. We were constantly on the back foot, trying to outmaneuver an enemy that seemed one step ahead. I remember standing in the cold, looking across the battlefield at the Polish forces lined up against us, their uniforms crisp and clean, their artillery poised for action. I felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another battle. This was a test of everything we had fought for. The promise of peace and land for the workers state that we had so desperately clung to, was all on the line, and we were failing. The battle for Warsaw in 1920 marked a turning point. We had been advancing steadily, pushing the Poles back until we reached the outskirts of their capital. The city was within our reach, and the idea of spreading the revolution westward seemed just within our grasp. But then, the Poles launched a counteroffensive that completely shattered our lines. Trotsky, ever the optimist, insisted that it was just a temporary setback, that we would regroup and take Warsaw, but I knew better. Our forces were exhausted, our morale shattered. The battle became a bloodbath. We had no reinforcements, no fresh troops, and the Polish forces cut us down one by one. The Mosin Nagants we carried were ineffective against their well-placed artillery. The Red Cavalry, once our pride, was scattered and broken. I saw comrades fall around me, their bodies swallowed up by the dust of the battlefield. We had been marching for months without rest, our bodies on the brink of collapse. There was no glory in this fight, only death. I can still see the smoke rising from the battlefield after our defeat. The Red Army had been thrown back, and the revolution, which had seemed so unstoppable just a year before, now seemed like a fading dream. I had given everything for the cause, but in the end I wasn't sure what we had won. The loss of Warsaw was a devastating blow, and it marked the beginning of the end for our campaign. We retreated, and the dreams of spreading the revolution across Europe began to crumble. But what hurt the most was that I no longer felt the fire of belief that had once driven me. The Red Army was supposed to be fighting for the workers, for the peasants, for a world free of capitalist oppression. But now, it felt like we were fighting just to survive, fighting not for ideals, but for a regime that had lost its way. I had seen the brutality of war on the Eastern Front, but this was different. The defeat in Poland had shattered something inside me. It wasn't just the loss of land, the loss of Warsaw. It was the realization that Trotsky's revolution had failed. The Polish-Soviet War wasn't about freedom anymore. It was about a state that was too broken, too divided to spread its ideals beyond its borders. We had lost, and it seemed that no matter how many battles we fought, no matter how many comrades we buried, the revolution would never reach the promise we had been sold. The war with Poland was more than just a military defeat. It was the moment when I realized that the revolution I had joined had already started to betray us all. Trotsky was still convinced we could win, that we could bring the revolution to the West, but I had already seen too much to believe in his words anymore. As we retreated back into the heart of Russia, I couldn't help but feel like we were moving backward, not forward. The hope of the revolution had been replaced by the crushing weight of disillusionment. Stalin's influence was growing, and the Red Terror was spreading across the land. People were being executed for speaking against the regime, for questioning the new government that was supposed to bring freedom. It wasn't just the White Army we had to fight now. It was the new Soviet state itself, with its hunger for control, its thirst for power. I remember walking through the streets of Moscow, hearing the sounds of executions in the distance, the whispers of dissent crushed under the boots of the new Soviet authorities. I had come so far, fought for so long, but now I was no longer sure who I was fighting for. The ideals that had brought me to the revolution had faded, replaced by a machine that consumed everything in its path. By 1920, the revolution was no longer the vibrant dream of equality and freedom that I had first joined. It was something darker, something more sinister. The Polish defeat had been a blow, but what came after was even worse. The Red Army may have won the battle in Russia, but what we were fighting for was becoming increasingly unclear. Lenin's promises of a better world felt hollow in the face of constant bloodshed, starvation, and the relentless march of Stalin's influence. I had seen the horrors of war up close, but in 1921, I was forced to confront something much worse: the growing Red Terror that gripped the country. It began with whispers, rumors of people being disappeared, but soon those whispers became a reality. The Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, grew in power and terror, hunting down anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activities, even if those activities were nothing more than a quiet disagreement with the regime. I had fought for the workers, for the peasants who had been promised land and liberty, but what I saw now was a regime that was built not on freedom, but on fear. Fear of the people, fear of dissent, fear of betrayal. The Cheka were everywhere, their eyes always watching, listening. No one was safe. I remember the night when they came for one of my old comrades. Alexei had fought with me in the south, in the trenches of the Caucasus, but now, in the shadow of the Red Terror, he had become a target. The soldiers of the Red Army were no longer comrades. We were tools of the state. Lenin's ideals had been corrupted by the hunger for power. The revolution had become a machine, one that crushed everything in its path: dissent, freedom, humanity. And the worst part was that we couldn't stop it. I remember sitting with Alexei in a small tavern one night, speaking about the early days of the revolution, about the hope we had felt. But that hope had died long ago. The Bolshevik regime that we had fought for had betrayed us, and we didn't know who to trust anymore. One day the Cheka came for Alexei. I don't know what they accused him of, but it didn't matter. It was enough that he had questioned the Soviet leadership, enough that he had dared to speak out against the atrocities that had become commonplace. They took him in the middle of the night, dragged him from his home, and shot him in the streets. I heard the shots echoing through the quiet town, and I knew that my comrade was dead. The revolution had taken him, as it had taken so many others. It had consumed him. But it wasn't just the Cheka that I feared. The Bolshevik government itself was becoming more oppressive with each passing day. Trotsky, once the fiery leader of the Red Army, was now just a puppet in a game controlled by men like Stalin. The promises of bread, peace, and land had been replaced by forced collectivization, by purges, by executions. I began to feel like a stranger in my own country. The land was still ravaged by war, the peasants still starving, But the revolution that had promised them a better life was now just another form of oppression. I had fought for the workers, but now they were the ones being crushed by the very system that had promised to lift them up, and I was complicit in it. I remember the day we were sent to Ukraine to deal with the anarchist forces of Nestor Makhno. Makhno's Black Army had been fighting the White Army, but they had become a threat to the Bolsheviks as well. The peasants in Ukraine had rallied to Makhno's cause, tired of the Bolshevik regime and its heavy-handed tactics. But instead of negotiating, instead of finding a way to bring peace, the Red Army was sent in to crush them. It was a brutal campaign, full of atrocities on both sides. I remember the looks of desperation on the faces of the peasants who had once supported the revolution, now caught between two forces they could no longer trust. The war had become something else. It wasn't about ideals anymore. It was about control. Stalin's power was growing with each passing day, and I began to see the true face of the Bolshevik government, a government that would stop at nothing to maintain its grip on power. By the time the Red Army defeated Makhno's forces, I was a broken man. The revolution had failed. The workers' state that I had fought for, that I had believed in with all my heart, had become just another form of tyranny, and I was no longer sure what we had won. By 1921, the revolution I had joined had become unrecognizable. The promises of freedom, equality, and land for the workers had long since faded into the cold, hard reality of Soviet rule. The Bolsheviks were no longer liberators. They were rulers, ruthless, pragmatic, and determined to hold on to power at all costs. In truth, I didn't even recognize the country I had fought for anymore. The Civil War had already torn Russia apart, but now, in the ashes of that conflict, Stalin, Lenin, and the rest of the Bolshevik leadership were consolidating power. Trotsky, the man who had been the face of the Red Army, was sidelined. The revolution, once fueled by fiery speeches and promises of a better world, now seemed more like a machinery of oppression. The country was suffocating under the weight of a government that no longer had any room for dissent, for difference of opinion, or for the ideals we had fought so hard for. I remember the day I heard the news about Trotsky's downfall. He had been removed from his position as the head of the Red Army, and his influence had been slowly chipped away by Stalin. The old comrades, the ones who had fought alongside us in the early days of the revolution, were being purged one by one. Beria, Yezhov, and the others in the NKVD were tightening their grip on the country. It felt like the revolution was eating itself alive, and there was nothing any of us could do to stop it. The country had already been through the horrors of war and famine, but now we were facing something even worse, the Great Famine of 1921 to 1922. The Bolshevik government, in its efforts to collectivize agriculture and exert control over the peasantry, had sent troops to seize grain from the Ukrainian farmers. The peasants were already starving, but the Bolsheviks saw the grain as a commodity to be controlled. The Chekas' harsh tactics drove the Ukrainians to revolt, but that revolt was crushed without mercy. I remember the hunger, the smell of decay in the air, and the hollow looks in the faces of those around me. We were told that the famine was necessary for the greater good, that it would strengthen the revolution. But how could I believe that? How could anyone believe that killing the very people who had supported us would help the cause? The revolution I had joined in good faith had become a machine that consumed its own people. Even as the Bolshevik government fought to hold power, the country's infrastructure was collapsing. The railroads were in disarray, food was scarce, and the cities were overcrowded with refugees. Yet, amid the chaos, the Bolsheviks continued their campaign of consolidation. They established communist committees, sending agents into towns to root out any signs of disloyalty, to root out any traces of opposition. These agents weren't the Red Guards I had fought beside in 1917. They were merciless, calculating, and loyal to nothing but their own power. And as the years dragged on, it became clear that the country was no longer being governed by the ideals of the revolution, but by fear. I had been through so much already. I had fought on the Eastern Front, struggled through the Polish-Soviet War, and endured countless battles. But now, in the ruins of the revolution, I felt more lost than ever. Stalin's rise to power was inevitable. He had solidified control, and now the Soviet Union was his domain. The NKVD patrolled the streets, and Trotsky, that once glorious leader of the Red Army, was gone, exiled, or executed. No one could say for certain. The Cheka had grown into the NKVD, and the terror they unleashed was more potent than ever. Comrades turned against each other in the blink of an eye, afraid to speak a word out of line, terrified that even a whisper of dissent would mean their death. I spent those years in a haze, living in fear, unsure of where I belonged in this new world. The country had been torn apart by war and revolution, and now it was being torn apart again by Stalin's terror. Men I had once fought beside were being dragged from their homes, taken to the gulags and executed without trial. Lenin's dream had died in the streets, and what replaced it was something dark and suffocating. And yet, despite it all, I couldn't turn my back on the revolution. I had fought for it, bled for it, and even as it became something unrecognizable, I still believed that it could become something better. But as the years passed, that belief was stretched thinner and thinner until it finally snapped. I tried to return to the life I had known before the war. I went back to the village where I grew up, the place that had once been full of hope. But it was no longer the same. The fields were barren, the houses empty. The people who had once been hopeful for the future were now wary, distrustful, looking over their shoulders. The Soviet regime had already infiltrated every corner of society, and there was no space left for anyone who dared to oppose it. In the quiet of the village, I found no answers, only more questions. Where had the revolution gone wrong? Had it been wrong from the start? Was there ever a chance for the world we had dreamed of? Or had we always been doomed to become the very thing we fought against? I stood in the fields that had once been full of life and felt the weight of the past pressing down on me. The revolution was over, and I didn't know what it had all meant. All I knew was that I had fought for a future that never came, and now the world I had built with my comrades was gone, buried beneath the Red Terror, the famine, and the iron grip of a state that had promised us freedom only to crush us under the weight of its power. By 1923, the revolution had been won, or so they said. The streets were still marked by the battle scars of the war, but the fighting had ceased. The White Army had been scattered, and Kolchak, Denikin, and Wrangel were distant memories, figures whose legacies had been erased in the victory of the Red Army. Yet, as I walked through the streets of Moscow, I realized that the victory felt hollow. It wasn't the kind of victory that came with joy, with celebration. It felt like a death knell. The revolution had died a long time ago, and what remained was just the shell of a regime that had crushed everything that had once been pure about the cause. The Soviet Union had emerged from the rubble of war, a new power that stretched across the land, controlling everything from the factories to the fields, from the peasants to the intelligentsia. The Bolshevik regime had consolidated power, and under the new economic policy, NEP, there was a fragile sense of normalcy returning to the country. But beneath the surface, I could feel something different, something I couldn't quite place. The feeling of hope was gone. It had been replaced by a creeping fear, a constant awareness that the state was watching, listening, waiting for any sign of dissent. The Red Terror had officially ended, but in its place came a quieter form of control. There was no more open bloodshed, no more purges in the streets, but the NKVD still cast its shadow over the country. The party lines were drawn firmly, and Stalin's influence continued to grow stronger. No one dared to speak out anymore, not openly. The revolution had in many ways cannibalized itself, devouring its own ideals and leaving behind only the ruthless machinery of state control. I saw men who had once fought beside me, who had once been brothers in arms, now silent, their eyes haunted by the choices they had made. I thought about my own choices. I had fought for Lenin, for the workers' state. I had believed in the Bolshevik dream when it was fresh, when it was full of life and promise. But now, in the ruins of that dream, I found only betrayal. Stalin's purges were becoming a reality, even though they hadn't yet reached their full scope. The repression was palpable, but it was slow and insidious, almost invisible to those who had not lived through the violence of the early days. The Cheka had turned into a force of intimidation, where silence was the greatest weapon. I had seen comrades disappear without a trace, but now it was different. It wasn't as open. It wasn't as obvious. The Bolshevik Party had transformed into something far less honorable, and the ideals of 1917 had been suffocated beneath the weight of bureaucratic control. I walked through the streets, passing by the workers' communes and party offices, and I saw something that had once been a symbol of hope, now turned into a machine of oppression. The new economic policy had brought some relief to the peasantry, allowing them to sell their grain and keep some of the profits, but the state still controlled everything. I saw men at the market bargaining over meager goods, their faces hollowed out by years of war, famine, and revolution. They no longer talked about the future. They only talked about surviving. The promise of peace and bread was as empty as the bellies of those who had fought for it. But what haunted me most were the silences, the way people no longer spoke freely. The conversations in cafes, in factories, in the streets were all guarded. People whispered, but no one dared to speak their mind. The Bolsheviks had won the war, but at what cost? We had sacrificed everything, the lives of millions, the ideals of a better world. And for what? A country where fear was the only currency, where loyalty to the party was demanded at the cost of the truth. What had we fought for? What had we gained? I met a man once, an old soldier like me who had fought in the early days of the revolution. We had shared meals in the trenches, fought side by side, but when we met again in Moscow in 1923, he was a hollow version of the man I once knew, He had been a part of the Red Guards, but now he was a bitter shell, looking over his shoulder at every corner. He spoke in hushed tones, afraid even to speak my name in public. His eyes darted around, searching for signs of spies, of informants. He had no hope left. His once vibrant revolutionary zeal had been crushed under the weight of Stalin's regime. He had seen his comrades disappear into the night, never to return, taken by the NKVD for reasons no one could explain. And he feared that his time would come too. That fear was infectious. It crept into me too. I thought back to the days when I had believed in the revolution, when we had fought for something greater than ourselves. But now, in the quiet after the storm, I could see the rot that had set in. The Red Army, once the pride of the revolution, had become another instrument of control, another tool of the state. The ideals of Lenin, who had promised to dismantle the old structures of power, had been replaced by a new form of tyranny. And I was complicit. I had fought for this. We all had. By 1923, it was clear to me that the revolution had become something else, something that no longer cared about the people, no longer cared about the workers or the peasants. It had become a machine that consumed everything in its path. Stalin's grip on power had tightened, and anyone who dared to speak out, who dared to question the party's methods, was silenced. I stood in the streets, the sounds of Moscow ringing in my ears, and realized that the country I had fought for was gone. The old regime had been replaced, but it had been replaced by something far worse. The new regime was not a workers' state. It was an empire built on fear, on surveillance, on lies, and we, the men who had fought in the revolution, had built it. By 1923, the revolution had become a shadow of what it had once promised. The Bolsheviks had won, the White Army scattered, but we were left with a country in ruins. The war was over, but the fight wasn't. The Russian Civil War had torn the fabric of the empire apart, and now we were living in the wake of that destruction. There was no peace, only fear, hunger, and a sense of deep loss. I had come home to my village, or what was left of it. The buildings were half destroyed, the fields had been left to rot, and the people who once filled the streets were now gaunt, their faces hollow with years of famine, war, and the promises that had never been kept. The peasants had been promised land, but they had been given nothing but collectivization, which had only brought more misery. The lands they once farmed were now under state control, and the workers were now just laborers for the Soviet machine. I remember the bitter cold of those early months after the war. Famine was still a reality, though the NEP had tried to bring some relief. The small amount of private trade was allowed, but it felt like a mockery. People were starving, but the government still controlled everything. The state had taken over the land, the factories, and the minds of the people. We had fought to escape oppression, but it had come back in a different form. The Soviet Union was now a machine of control, and its gears were grinding the people beneath them. I watched as my friends, my fellow soldiers, began to fade. Some had stayed in the army, some had gone into the government, and some, like me, had returned to the land. But none of us had what we thought we would have. We had been promised a better future, a workers' paradise, but instead we were left with bureaucracy, terror, and survival. We were not living in the world we had fought for. We were living in a country where loyalty to the party had become the only currency. The NKVD was everywhere. You couldn't talk to anyone without wondering if they were an informant. People disappeared and no one spoke about it. They were taken in the dead of night, arrested without trial, and lost to the vast network of labor camps that dotted the country. I had seen it before: the arrests, the disappearances, the brutal beatings. But now it felt more widespread. Everyone was afraid, and I, like everyone else, had learned to live with that fear. I remember one night sitting in a small tavern in the heart of Moscow, listening to a group of men talk about the great days of the revolution. They spoke of the early victories of the Red Guards, of Trotsky's speeches, and the excitement of 1917, but their voices were flat, resigned. They were old men, even though they were no older than I was. The revolution had stolen the youth from all of us. It had stolen our hope, our joy, our humanity. There was no glory in our victory, only silence and the weight of what we had become. The conversation shifted, as it always did, to the Soviet regime. Stalin's grip on power was tightening, and no one dared speak against him, not openly. We all knew what had happened to those who had opposed him. Trotsky, once the brilliant leader of the Red Army, had been exiled, his name erased from history. The cult of personality around Stalin had grown, and anyone who questioned it was labeled a counter-revolutionary. I looked around the table at the men I had once fought with, and I saw the same thing in their eyes: fear. Fear that they too might be taken away, accused of something they didn't understand. We had survived the war, but at what cost? Our comrades had died in the trenches, in the streets, on the front lines. And now we were living in a country where the dreams we had fought for were buried beneath the weight of Soviet control. What was left of the revolution? What was left of the Red Army's glory? The peasants were still starving, the workers still toiling in the factories, and the party had become nothing more than a tool for Stalin's power. As the years went on, I began to lose track of what I was fighting for. The revolution that had once filled me with hope had become a machine of repression, a tool of control that had swallowed everything it had promised. I had once believed in Trotsky's vision of spreading revolution to the world, of creating a workers' state. But now, I didn't know what I believed in anymore. I had seen too much. I had seen too many men broken by the system. I had seen too many people disappear. And I had seen the Soviet state become the very thing it had fought to destroy. By 1923, the war was over. But the wounds it left on me and on this country seemed far from healed. The Soviet Union was no longer the dream of a workers' paradise I had believed in. It had become a reality filled with harsh, cold truths. The revolution I had fought for, bled for, and witnessed so much destruction in the name of had long since turned into a state I no longer recognized. In the early days, we had believed in the Bolshevik cause. We had followed Lenin, marched for the Red Guards, and fought against the forces of the White Army in the streets of Petrograd. We had believed we were part of something monumental. The world was supposed to be different, better. But as the years passed, it became clear that the ideals that drove us had been swallowed up by power, by control, by an apparatus that no longer cared about the people who had made the revolution possible. I had returned to Moscow after a few years, unsure of where I belonged. The city was recovering, but it was a different kind of place now. It was a place where fear lingered in the air, where the NKVD watched everyone, where the once vibrant voices of revolution had been replaced by silence. I had thought that after the war, after all the sacrifice, there would be peace. But the peace we found was a fragile one. It was the kind of peace that only existed when people were too afraid to speak out, when the streets were filled with the whispers of those who had learned that survival meant keeping quiet. I went back to my old unit at the Red Army, where the new soldiers barely knew what it had been like to fight in those early days. The officers had changed, the uniforms were different, and the spirit of the revolution, if it had ever truly existed, was now a distant memory. The government had taken the reins, and the officers followed without question, eager to please Stalin and ensure their own survival. They no longer cared about Trotsky's ideals or the workers' state. They cared about keeping their place in the new order. As I wandered through the Red Square and looked at the monumental buildings, it felt like nothing but a reflection of the regime's hollow promises. Lenin's mausoleum was there, but Lenin himself felt like a ghost. His face, preserved for the nation to worship, was a symbol of what had been lost. The Soviet Union had swallowed the dreams of the revolution, but had it created anything better? The answer, I realized, was no. I began to question everything I had fought for. Was this really the world we had sacrificed so much for? Lenin, Trotsky, even Stalin, they had all promised us a new world, but they were just men, wielding power like anyone else. The ideals they spoke of were nothing more than a tool to keep the people under control. The peasants were still hungry, the workers were still exploited, and the Bolshevik government, once the beacon of hope, was now a bureaucratic machine that suffocated everything in its path. I met a few old comrades during my time in Moscow, men who had once fought beside me, who had once been driven by the same ideals. But now they were broken. They had either joined the new party, corrupted by power, or they had retreated into the shadows, too afraid to speak up. No one dared to question the Soviet state. To do so was to risk everything. As time passed, I began to understand the true cost of survival. The revolution hadn't freed us. It hadn't made the world a better place. It had taken away everything we had fought for and replaced it with a different kind of tyranny, one that was less visible but just as suffocating. It wasn't just the NKVD that terrorized us. It was the fear itself, the fear that anyone at any moment could be swept away by the new regime's reach. Stalin's purges had begun, and with them the terror that would grip the country for years to come. I had been lucky to survive, but at what cost? I left Moscow in 1925. I didn't know where to go, but I couldn't stay in a place that felt like a prison. The Soviet Union had become a place of surveillance, of fear, of lives lived in the shadow of power. The revolution was dead, and I had outlived it. What had been a dream for so many had turned into a nightmare, and I, along with countless others, had become a casualty of that nightmare.